So let me just welcome everyone to this Lunch and Learn with being presented by Reverend Dr. Denise Yarbrough. She is the director of, you'll have to remind me, Denise, of Interfaith,
Religious and Spiritual Life.
Religious and Spiritual Life at the University of Rochester. And she's also an Episcopal priest. And I'll let her say more about herself, but I'm very grateful, Denise, that you're willing to be with us and willing to share your experience and your expertise around interfaith interaction and how to engage and how you have been engaging interfaith dialogue in our area here. So Denise, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks. I guess the only other thing I'd say, I've been here at the University of Rochester for 10 years, Director of Religious and Spiritual Life, which means I oversee the Interfaith Chapel, which has all these multi-religious faiths as a part of the community. But in all my years of ordained ministry in the Episcopal Church, I've been really active as the Canon for Interreligious and Ecumenical Affairs within the Episcopal Church, serve on the task force of the National Church for Interreligious and Ecumenical Affairs. So I've done the sort of the interfaith thing as a representative of the Episcopal Church for years too, and been pretty active in all the interfaith stuff that happens in Rochester, of which there is quite a lot, although COVID kind of quieted things down, unfortunately. But we've had a pretty robust interfaith community up here. What I'm going to do today is kind of two-pronged, as I explained to Marianne. I'm going to do the first bit, kind of presentations I do in a lot of places about just sort of what is religious diversity in our modern world and how do we navigate it, and some things if you're interested in sort of being sort of interreligiously competent, things that you should be thinking about and know about and kind of be aware of. And then the second part, I'm going to talk a bit more about within the Christian tradition, a very fast, like 2-second history of interreligious dialogue and the theologies of religious pluralism and sort of how the Christian denominations have sort of come to recognize the importance of it. And then we can have conversations in any direction anybody wants to go. And now we got to figure out, oh, that's what we have to do. Okay. Stephen Prothero is a great scholar of religion. He teaches at Boston University and has written some really good books. God Is Not One being the most recent. He's a real proponent of what I'm a proponent of, is that you really need to know something about the religions of the world, whether you are religious or not. As he points out, religion is not merely a private affair. It matters socially, economically, politically, and militarily. Religion may or may not move mountains, but it is one of the prime movers of politics worldwide. Even if religion makes no sense to you, you need to make sense of religion to make sense of the world. That's a quote I throw out at my students here on campus quite frequently, because we have a very secular campus and a lot of kids are like, I don't need to know about religion. I'm not religious. Like, well, actually, a lot of the world is. So maybe you do need to know something about it. And I love this quote from John Kerry when he was the Secretary of State. If I went back to college today, I think I'd probably major in comparative religion, because that's how integrated it is in everything we're working on and deciding and thinking about in life today. So in his work, doing diplomacy and international relations, he realized, gee, knowing something about religions is kind of important. Mm-hmm. The demographics of religion in the United States have changed somewhat since the mid-20th century. And these statistics show you some of the changes. We're still a predominantly Christian nation, to be sure. 69.05% are Christian. The rise since the change in the immigration laws in 1965, however, of the sort of other world religions besides Christianity has gone up quite a bit. I mean, 5% is a lot more than in 1965. It would have been 0.00000 something. There were that many because we had forbidden pretty much immigration from most Asian countries for most of the 20th century. But now there's a much greater presence in our culture of Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs and Jains and people from South Asia. So we still have a lot of Christians, although even the demographics of Christianity have changed quite a bit from the mid-20th century, when the mainline Protestants were sort of the main denominations and representation of Christians. Now it's more the evangelical Protestants, and Catholics are still doing pretty well, largely because even though sort of white Catholics, European Catholics are on the descent in terms of numbers, as are the mainline Protestants, Hispanic immigration to this country keeps the numbers of Catholics fairly high. What's been talked about a lot in the last few years is the significant rise in our population of people who claim no affiliation to religion at all. You know, back in the mid 20th century, most people would have been able to tell you their religion, even if they weren't particularly religious. They knew what it was. Now, the overall numbers are 23%, but the numbers of young people, the millennials, people under 30, is much higher, as we will see here. So the rise of the nuns, as they're called, is pretty significant. And you can see when you're talking the 18 to 29-year-old group, 36%, 38%, that's a lot. That's a whole lot. Fully more than a third of that population claims no religious affiliation, which is not to say that they don't engage in spiritual practices or an occasional participation in something religious, but they don't feel connected to any organized denomination or religious tradition. This area up here is pretty religiously diverse. We have virtually, in Rochester, we have, you name it, Christian denomination, we've got it. We've got all of the movements of Judaism here. We have a lot of Muslims. We have the Islamic Center, we have the Turkish Cultural Center, and a whole bunch of local smaller mosques and local communities. We have 2 Hindu temples. We have 2 Sikh gurdwaras. We have the Zen Center, Tibetan Buddhism in a couple of places, and a Laotian Buddhist temple out in Rush. Of course, we have a fairly good, robust group of Mormons, since they were founded in Palmyra and are close by. Similarly, spiritualists, we have quite a few of those because they were founded in this region in the 19th century. We've got the Unitarian Universalists, pagans, Baha'i, so you name it, we've got it. And on this slide are pictures of these various worship places. I mean, this is the Hindu temple, that's the Mormon temple in Palmyra, that's the Sikh Gurdwara, that's the Laotian Buddhist temple. This is Temple Sinai, a Reformed synagogue. This is the Unitarian Universalists. This is Christ Church Episcopal downtown. There's the Islamic Center. So, you know, in this area, we've got sort of the world religions represented in good numbers. So to increase religious literacy, I think there's sort of key areas you need to learn about and be aware of so that you can function in a religiously pluralistic space, namely sacred space. How and where do these folks worship? Sacred time. How do they deal with seasons of the year, seasons of life? Sacred foods and forbidden foods. Death, which is obviously an issue in all religions. And then be aware of current events that have religious implications that are happening in the world. Because even if they're happening outside of this country, when you live in a place like Rochester, where we have a lot of immigrant communities, the things that are happening somewhere else affect people here. And so, and some of the tensions that are playing out somewhere else will play out here because we've got people from there here. So sacred spaces, I always challenge my students, you know, for the major religions of the world, do you know where they practice their rituals and what that place is called? Do you know what they call their religious leaders? Do you know what the function of their religious leaders are? In your local community, you know, where are these sacred spaces for the diverse religions? If you find out where they are, it's sometimes a good idea to arrange to go have a visit and see how they worship and what they do. For people in schools and workplaces, you know, are there places that people can practice their religion, like Muslims who have to do the 5 times a day prayer? Is there somewhere that they can go that's quiet and private that they can pray? It doesn't take long to do the prayers, but they need a place to do it. A lot of workplaces are now setting up like quiet rooms or meditation rooms so that people can do that. So you'll see in this picture, I mean, that's a Hindu temple, there's a mosque, that's a Sikh Gurdwara, synagogue, a Buddhist temple, Orthodox Christian church, and either Catholic or Protestant church. This represents secular humanism. That's a Shinto, entrance to a Shinto shrine. But just to be aware of architecture and, you know, how what these places are called and who the leaders are is something to learn. And at the end, I'll give you some good resources that you can go to beef up your religious literacy. Sacred time. It's important to know the major holidays and festivals and feast and fast days of the different faith communities that are in your area, because if these are folks that you are dealing with, it's important to know, you know, when they're marking their high holy days. When is Ramadan? You know, that 30-day period of fasting for the Muslims. It moves through the calendar every year. It's important to know if you have Muslim neighbors or Muslim coworkers or Muslim patients or whatever, when that very important time is going to come. When is Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the fall holidays for the Jews? It's always in the fall, but they move around. When is Diwali? It tends to come in late October, November, but every year the date moves a bit. That's a major celebration for folks from South Asia, Hindus, but Sikhs and Jains also, and even frankly, Muslims in India celebrate it because it's sort of their equivalent of Christmas in terms of big, huge national celebration. Holi is their spring festival of color. You know, Christmas and Easter, people tend to know because they're kind of national holidays in our calendar. But Buddha's birthday, the winter solstice, the Lunar New Year, like on our campus, we have many students from China and other Asian countries. So the Lunar New Year is like a big deal for them. So we have to sort of be aware that, oh, this is this in their culture, this is really big. And even though they have to go to class, we generally try to have ways for them to mark that important time in their calendar. There's a lot of interfaith calendars available online, so it's pretty easy to go online and just sort of find out when these dates are. And certainly if you're planning any kind of big community events, and you know that there's folks in your community from these different traditions, it's kind of polite to sort of check those things out so that you're not conflicting with something that's really important to them when you schedule something. Especially if clergy and religious leaders want to sort of interfaithly engage with their neighbors who are not like them, it's usually a good idea to know something about when these holidays are happening and not schedule anything those days that you expect them to show up to. Sacred foods, you know, all traditions have their special foods. We've got the bread and wine of the Eucharist there. These are a lot of the different kinds of spices that are used in Hindu temples that are made as offerings to the deities. The Seder plate in the Jewish tradition, the challah and the wine for the Sabbath in the Jewish tradition. Here is a picture of the dates and the water, and dates and water are what Muslims use when they break the fast in Ramadan. And of course, in many traditions, there are things that are dietary restrictions, things that are allowed or not allowed. No caffeine or coffee for Mormons, for example. In the Jewish tradition, food has to be kosher and certified as such for people that, you know, keep the dietary restrictions. For Muslims, meat has to be halal, as in both kosher and halal really is an issue of requiring a certain ritual slaughter and prayers to be said at the time of the slaughter. Both Muslims and Jews don't eat pork. Hindus are often vegetarian, but if not, they don't eat beef. And many traditions don't allow alcohol. And then, especially for folks doing chaplaincy work, you know, how do these traditions deal with death? Do they believe in an afterlife or not? Do they believe in reincarnation, which is typical in most of the Eastern traditions of the world? What are their rituals around burial? Do they bury? Do they cremate? What are the rituals at time of death? I don't know if any of you saw any of the rituals that were being done when Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk of great fame, died back in the spring. His monastery was live streaming. I mean, the rituals that went on for him took a good 8 days. Lots and lots of prayer around the body, moving the body, all kinds of offerings being made. There's a belief within a lot of Buddhist traditions that, you know, the soul of the deceased person sort of hangs around for pretty much a week or so. And so all these prayers and rituals are meant to sort of help them have a better next birth. And so that's an important time. So knowing, you know, what happens when somebody dies, again, in like Muslim traditions and Jewish traditions, it has typically been the case that they bury the person within 24 hours. In this culture now, a lot of Jews and Muslims, because they've got families spread out all over the place, have started to sometimes postpone that because they just need time for family to arrive. But certainly traditionally, it's done within 24 hours and it's burial, not cremation. And as many of you probably know, that Jews will then sit Shiva for 7 days, which is their mourning ritual. So knowing how people, you know, approach death is kind of critical in understanding who they are. And again, particularly people that work in healthcare and chaplaincy. And I think it's important to be interfaithly aware of world events that are particularly toxic and that cause all kinds of conflicts so that you're at least aware when you're starting to walk into dangerous territory that that's what you're doing. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is huge and has lots of repercussions even over here. There are a lot of tensions in Pakistan and India between Hindus and Muslims, with the rise of Hindu nationalism in India in the last many years. The Muslim-Hindu tensions have gotten much, much greater. They were not so bad there for a while, but they've been raised up again. And that's important. I mean, I've noticed it here in Rochester because we have a big South Asian community, and the Pakistanis and the Indians, who tend to be Hindu and Sikh, socialize with one another a lot because they have so much in common culturally. But you can see often the tensions that arise because of stuff that's going on over there between Pakistan and India, and within India with Modi and the Muslims. The tensions around China's occupation of Tibet can play out. We have to be careful on our campus because we've got so many Chinese students, so that can be a hot button here. Then the persecution of the Rohingya Muslims by the Buddhists in Myanmar, and they've been driven into Bangladesh. Important to know, Buddhists have pretty much had a really good history of not being nasty, but that particular conflict is an exception to the rule. There's a lot of talk and attention these days on the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims in China. The Chinese government essentially has them in detention camps. And then in many of the countries like ours and Canada and other colonizing nations, the issues around the treatment of Indigenous peoples and how we deal with our terrible history around the treatment of Indigenous peoples is becoming a very much an issue in interfaith circles and in intercultural circles generally. Land acknowledgements are becoming much more common in a lot of institutions, but land acknowledgements alone, without any actual policies or procedures that embrace Indigenous peoples or offer to make reparations, may not be well received, because sometimes the criticism has been that these land acknowledgements are sort of performative, but there's no substance behind it. So one has to be sensitive to that. We're actually working on those kinds of issues here at U of R right now. And then you need to be aware of just different cultural taboos, like gender separation in Islam and Orthodox Judaism. If you spend a lot of time with the Muslim community, you'll realize that they are far more they segregate men and women far more frequently than we in the West do. Like if you go to the Islamic Center and there's, their version of a sort of after church supper, the women and the men sit separately. And that's not something that we Westerners are as accustomed to. And most Muslim women don't want to shake hands with men who are not members of their family. Similarly, Orthodox Jews are the same way. Orthodox Jewish men, Hasidic men, don't want to shake the hands of any woman outside their family, and similarly, the Orthodox Jewish women. Both the Orthodox Jews and Muslims have very modest dress codes, which are often quite different from the more revealing modes of dress in Western culture. Dating and sexual behavioral practices are very different in a lot of these traditions, even here on this campus. I mean, we're a college, right? And we've got modern, fraternity, sorority life and hookup culture and all the rest of it. But our Muslim students, our Hindu students from India, our Asian students, a lot of them, they do not engage in dating because they come from cultures still, and a lot of our African students come from cultures where marriages are still arranged and people do not date in the way that Westerners do. So again, a thing we have to be conscious of. You have to think about what are the cultural and religious approaches to divorce. Those vary significantly, not only within religions, but within the cultures that different religions lived out in. Restrictions on alcohol use are fairly common in a lot of traditions. As I mentioned before, there's dietary restrictions to be aware of. So anytime one is planning any kind of an event that involves food, if there's going to be folks from religiously diverse cultures attending, one has to think carefully about what food is going to be served. Be aware of times of fasting. I mean, I always say, in workplaces, don't arrange a lunch meeting if you have Muslim employees during Ramadan, because that's not culturally sensitive. And issues around personal appearance and attire. Obviously, in the Muslim tradition, we know a lot of women veil. Sikhs wear their turbans. A lot of observant Jews wear a kippah. So these are things to be aware that this is what these folks do, and it's got religious significance, and we have to be respectful of it. Diana Eck at Harvard University, the founder of the Pluralism Project, and she's actually a scholar of Hinduism and East Asian religions, but she's sort of the grand poobah of all things pluralism. She founded the Pluralism Project, and that's a site I would recommend if you want to sort of beef up your religious literacy. The pluralism.org. You go to that website, and there is a wealth of information. I mean, so much online, easily accessible resources that you can find about all different world religions and sort of their basic beliefs and practices. There's lots of photos and videos, and there's also usually some really good essays about how that tradition is being lived out in America and ways that things that are coming up for them as issues in this country as opposed to wherever they may have come from. So that's a phenomenal resource that I would encourage you to make use of. But Diana Eck's definition of pluralism is one that has been pretty widely accepted in interfaith circles as sort of the thing we're all striving for. So she makes a distinction between diversity, which is a given, and pluralism, which, as she says, is an achievement. She said, pluralism is not diversity alone, but the energetic engagement with diversity. Diversity can and has meant the creation of religious ghettos with little traffic between or among them. Today, religious diversity is a given, but pluralism is not a given. It is an achievement. Mere diversity without real encounter and relationship will yield increasing tensions in our societies. Second, pluralism is not just tolerance, but the active seeking of understanding across lines of difference. Tolerance is a necessary public virtue, but it does not require Christians and Muslims, Hindus, Jews, and ardent secularists to know anything about one another. Tolerance is too thin a foundation for a world of religious difference and proximity. It does nothing to remove our ignorance of one another and leaves in place the stereotype, the half-truth, the fears that underlie old patterns of division and violence. In the world in which we live today, our ignorance of one another will be increasingly costly. Third, pluralism is not relativism, but the encounter of commitments. The new paradigm of pluralism does not require us to leave our identities and our commitments behind. For pluralism is the encounter of commitments. It means holding our deepest differences, even our religious differences, not in isolation, but in relationship to one another. And fourth, pluralism is based on dialogue. The language of pluralism is that of dialogue and encounter, give and take, criticism and self-criticism. That self-criticism piece is really important because religious people are often not that good at being self-critical. Dialogue means both speaking and listening, and that process reveals both common understandings and real differences. Dialogue does not mean everyone at the table will agree with one another, but pluralism involves the commitment to being at the table with our commitments. So that's a lot to digest, but it's a really, really important foundational understanding of what it is we do when we're trying to do interfaith encounter and what it means to try to achieve religious pluralism in our culture. So a question arises, can interfaith dialogue serve as an antidote to the polarization and alienation that's in our world today? Obviously, some of us think it can, or at least can help. So some of the issues that come up around interfaith dialogue among religious people is, what is the purpose? Like, why are we doing it? What constitutes interfaith dialogue? Who engages in it? What are the potential benefits of interfaith dialogue, broadly construed? And what are the potential pitfalls of interfaith dialogue? And some of these questions, like who engages in it, I mean, certainly as in a minute, I'm going to give you the fast pass through the history. Initially, it was a lot of theologians and clergy and sort of high-level trained religious people that would sit around a table and have these sort of interreligious conversations. But a lot of interfaith dialogue has actually happened for centuries, sort of on the ground by people living next to one another, sort of sharing lived experiences because they happen to be neighbors and engaging with one another and learning about each other's sort of daily lived experience of their religious tradition without necessarily diving into theological issues and sort of talking about what's similar and what's different. So Jonathan Sacks, who died a couple of years ago now, was formerly the chief rabbi of England. wrote this book, The Dignity of Difference, How to Avoid the Clash of Civilizations, which was a phrase that came from a book by Samuel Huntington, in which he posited that the 21st century was going to be marked by these clashing civilizations, not so much nation states, but civilizations that are made up of certain culture and religious similarities, and that they were going to be, and he was very much looking at sort of Islam versus the West, and he's used the language of the West and the rest. And Jonathan Sacks, as a Jewish rabbi, went to the Jewish tradition. I mean, The Dignity of Difference, I strongly recommend. It's a terrific book. He says, the challenge of the religious imagination is to see God's image in one who is not in our image. That is the converse of tribalism. But it is also something other than universalism. It takes difference seriously. The faith of Israel declares the oneness of God and the plurality of man. It moves beyond both tribalism and its antithesis, universalism. Tribalism denies rights to the outsider. Universalism grants rights if and only if the outsider converts, conforms, assimilates, and thus ceases to be an outsider. The critical test of any order is, does it make space for otherness? Does it acknowledge the dignity of difference? And he actually has a whole section where he talks about, he thinks that's part of the distinction of the Jewish tradition, is that God called this tribe out of the ancient Near East to go to the land that he would show them, to go to the promised land, gives the covenant on Sinai, and they're meant to live that covenant as a distinct people, different from the rest of the world, to sort of encourage people to be able to live with difference, that was sort of their particular charism. And as a Jew, he would also joke about how sometimes they could have lived without that charism, because it hasn't always been a good ride for them being different. One of my favorite Christian theologians on pluralism is Paul Nitter, a Roman Catholic theologian. The Roman Catholics have been phenomenal in the theology that they've written on this stuff. Paul Nitter is an amazing theologian. He's actually a practicing Buddhist and a practicing Catholic. He was a Catholic priest. He left the priesthood to get married. He was a scholar, been a scholar of religion for all of his life, theologian, at a Catholic university. And then later in his life, because he was becoming as dedicated a multiple belonger and pluralist theologian as he was, he fell foul of some of the folks in Rome, and then he was teaching at Union Theological Seminary for many years. And one of his most recent books is Without the Buddha, I Could Not Be a Christian. But he also wrote a terrific sort of summary of the theologies of religious pluralism within the Christian tradition. Introducing the Theologies of Religions, is called. That is a phenomenal text. At seminaries, I always use that for students. This is a great introduction to the theologies of religious pluralism, because he does a magnificent job of synthesizing about 70, 80 years worth of a lot of different theologians writing out of different denominations within Christianity, and he sort of synthesizes them. But I love this quote of his: to have our own mother tongue and yet to be able to understand and converse in other cultural or religious languages is to feel the wonder and necessity of becoming what we might call world citizens. In this sense, all of us today are being called towards some degree of world citizenship. Two of the great threats facing the community of nations and cultures are the nationalism and fanaticism that grow among those who've never left their village and who think it's superior to all others. And he wrote that in 2002. And like 20 years later, the nationalism and fanaticism has only increased, unfortunately. So interfaith dialogue in the West, the fast history of that is, I mean, the sort of formal interfaith dialogue, oddly enough, started within the Christian tradition in the late 19th century, when Christian missionaries realized that they weren't having the successes they had hoped to have in converting people in other parts of the world to Christianity. And they realized that in order to really deal with these folks, they needed to learn something about their religions. I mean, and so initially they were trying to do it mostly in hopes that they could convert them. But over time, as we see in the history in the 20th century, as all these Christian theologians then started to delve into really thinking theologically about religious pluralism, it sort of gave birth to, lots of different theologies of religious pluralism, some of which are very much open to the religious other. So the modern interfaith movement was ironically sort of born out of Christians who were struggling to try to convert non-Christians to the tradition. And they were not having a great success at that. The Parliament of the World Religions in 1893 in Chicago is often looked at by scholars as sort of the official start of sort of global interfaith dialogue. It was the first time that representatives from both Western and Eastern traditions were sort of in one place, having dialogue with each other. It was actually the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And then the last few days, they had this special parliament, as they called it, of world religious traditions. And Swami Vivekananda from India was there. And that was like a big deal that this Hindu guru was there. And people in the United States became very fascinated with Hinduism as a result of that. The parliament didn't convene again until 100 years later in 1993, because the 20th century with 2 world wars and a depression kind of made it hard to do this sort of thing. So in 1993, actually, it was some of the groups that grew out of Swami Vivekananda's teachings said, oh, why don't we just do a little like anniversary thing for 100 years, that when this parliament took, they thought they were going to have a couple hundred people show up, and they had like 5,000 people. And they realized, oh, there's a real interest in people from all over the world convening to engage with one another. And so the parliaments have since been held about every, 5 or 6 years. Now it's 2 to 3. There was a parliament in 99 and 2004, in 2009 it was in Melbourne, 2015 in Salt Lake City, 2018 in Toronto, 2021 they did a virtual parliament, and they're going to do next August in back in Chicago again. And it's a massively huge gathering of religious leaders, religious scholars, religious practitioners, people in like NGOs and not-for-profit organizations all over the world. It has spiritual practices, it has academic lectures, it has art and music and dance. I mean, you name it, it happens. Another big event in the early 20th century was this World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh in 1910, where a lot of Christian denominations, missionary denominations, were really struggling with the need to become more religiously competent with other world religions. After the Second World War, the World Council of Churches was founded in 1948 in Europe. And there you've got the Christian denominations coming together after the Holocaust, recognizing, oh dear, our Christian anti-Judaism of many centuries gave birth to something pretty awful, and maybe we need to reconcile with the Jews, and we need to really think about how we work in the world. And so through that period in the mid-20th century, there's a lot of theology starting to be done in all the Christian denominations. A big step forward was Nostra Aetate, when the Vatican released their this proclamation in 1965 about other world religions. It was a major step forward. The Catholics have really been very much in the forefront of Christian interreligious engagement. And the World Council of Churches issued some guidelines for interfaith dialogue in 1979 that have ended up kind of being the gold standard for most local interfaith dialogues. And you can find them on the WCC website. In the rest of the world, it's interesting, this sort of structured kind of dialogue thing is very much a Western thing. And folks from the Middle East and Asia often like to point out that, they've been doing interfaith dialogue in a much more informal kind of way for centuries. In the Middle East, folks were living together next to people different from them, even the Abrahamic traditions. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam were living together side by side for centuries, quite peacefully, not having formal dialogue, but living together. In India, the various religions that grew out of Hinduism thrived right alongside the Hindu majority, which is why what's happening in India now is so disturbing, because it's so not what Hinduism has ever been about. Buddhism spread from India throughout most of Asia, China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, without eliminating any indigenous religions. Rather, it just sort of let them be, and it came alongside. So many of those Asian countries, you will see Buddhism and whatever the local indigenous traditions are being practiced side by side, often in the same places. It's mostly in the West, where you had religious evangelization and proselytization by Christians and Muslims, that you had this sort of tension that caused so much violence, that now requires this much more sort of conciliar kind of interfaith dialogue. And I always like to say, I love this example. So in the Hindu tradition, pluralism has always been a thing. This temple here was built around the 9th or 10th century. it's part of a historic site with some very interesting stuff. And this is a very modern temple that was built within the last 10 years or so. What's interesting is the architecture. So this spire here is very typical, traditional way that Hindu temples are built. And this is an active Hindu temple. This kind of rooftop is common in India for Buddhist temples, and the round topped buildings are typically mosques. So here you have a Hindu temple that it's a Vishnu temple. This particular one, I actually visited when I was in India, that architecturally includes Buddhist and Muslims who are part of their culture, right, as a part of their temple. Because again, for Hindus, like the fact that there are many faith traditions is sort of a given and something that they consider just fine, like not something to get hot and bothered about. You have the same thing here in the, you know, around the 10th century, the Hindu spire, the Buddhist one, and the mosque style rooftop. And again, this was an actual active at the time Hindu temple. So it's just, I mean, when I would look at that, I always think you would never see a church that would incorporate architectural designs from other religious buildings or synagogues or mosques. I mean, it just wouldn't happen. It's an interesting perspective from the eastern part of the world. And so for the resources, pluralism.org, as I mentioned before, that is a phenomenal resource that you should just like bookmark it on your computer, and you can go to it and find out anything you want to know about any world religion. The website for the Parliament of the World Religions is also a phenomenal site with lots and lots and lots of material up from many of the parliaments. And then these other ones are more for like workplace kinds of stuff. And I would say if there was one book you want to read about world religions that's very accessible and not, you know, terribly scholar. I mean, he is a scholar, but it's not like a dense book that's hard to get through. It's very readable. Is his God Is Not One by Stephen Prothero. So that's the formal stuff. At this point, I'm happy to just like chat. You have questions.
Thanks, Denise. Most people are muted right now. So if you have a question or if you want to make a comment, just know that you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Denise, you've talked a lot about the different world religions and different places in the world where people have immigrated to Rochester from. But here we also have, you know, a native indigenous population, and definitely have some people from that population who come through my setting.
Yeah,
trying to honor their own traditions and beliefs. Any comments on, I guess, how to be respectful of that, what, you know, how to be recognize what's important to them?
Yeah, that one's tough. I mean, the issue around indigenous folks is really hard because like we've had in the interfaith movement, we've even had a hard time trying to invite indigenous people, like, quote, to the table. For obvious reasons with the history, but also because for them, the whole way that we do interfaith, it makes no sense to them, because in an indigenous culture, religion is not like a separate thing that's over there. And then, you know, I do this and then I have my religion. Like it's completely interwoven into who they are and their entire way of being in the world, which is not something that we Westerners deal with well. And I was just having a conversation just a week or so ago with an indigenous person. I'm going to be teaching a course on public health and religion in the spring semester. And we were having just this conversation, and she was talking about the extent to which I gather a number of indigenous folks around here are very vaccine hesitant because they don't trust Western medicine for obvious reasons. And sort of, she was talking about it in her own family, some of the struggles they've had to try to blend Western medicine and indigenous practices, because they do have their own traditions of medicine and herbs and whatever that they do. And they want to be able to continue to do that, but trying to find a way to do it safely. I mean, she and I were having a conversation. I said, well, yeah, because depending on what medical procedures people are going through, like I have a friend who just went through a stem cell transplant and had no, immune system for weeks on end. You have to be really careful what substances you put in your body, right? When you don't have an immune system. So how, trying to find a way, I mean, I think the hardest thing for Western medical professionals with indigenous people is just earning their trust, because they don't, for obvious reasons, trust Western medicine at all. And, remember the history. I mean, they didn't have a lot of the diseases that Europeans had. Europeans arrived here and they were dying, the indigenous people were dying in droves from the diseases we brought to them, right? So I can imagine that it is a struggle, because there's a huge trust issue that has to be built up. So the only thing I could say is I think you have to really listen and work with them. I mean, this woman's story was fascinating. She was telling me about her own mother had tonsil cancer and they went to Western doctors, and of course they wanted to do, surgery and chemo and the whole thing. And her mother ultimately decided that no, she wanted to go with sort of the medical traditions of her indigenous tribe. And she did that. I guess she lasted 5 or 6 years. My guess is if she'd gone with Western medicine, she might still be alive, but that was her choice to make. But the daughter was, as she was telling me this story, said, after the mother sort of thought and reflected and then told the doctors, well, no, I think I'm going to work with within my indigenous tradition and with our medical practices. The doctors just looked at, like, were really intense and said, you do realize you have cancer, right? This is going to kill you. Like, the daughter didn't think that was, sensitive to where her mother was coming from. But I thought to myself, yeah, but if I was that doctor, I would have been pretty frustrated too, because it's like, but I don't think your indigenous medicine is not going to get rid of cancer, right? But she also said, she knows of ways in which members of her nation have actually, who had cancer and other kinds of things, have managed to blend some of their indigenous practices in with the Western medicine. But again, for that to work, I think you've really got to have a high level of trust.
Thank you.
That's going to take a while.
As you were talking, Denise, I was thinking too, not only just trust, but it gets back to this idea of pluralism, that you have to value what they're bringing to the table. You
Right.
can't, I can't say, look, this Western medicine is going to cure you. You have to say, well, is there a way it can be a both and, rather than my way, your way, to make this work for the good, for everybody's good health.
Right. It also occurred to me as she was talking, I thought, because of that history, like, indigenous tribes, as I understand the history, I mean, a lot of the diseases that were killing people in Europe, they just didn't have, right? And then Europeans came here and suddenly they were getting wiped out right and left because they didn't have the ability to fight things off, because they just never been exposed to these bugs. There's part of me that wants to say to the indigenous people, we brought you these nasty bugs, so now we need to give you the medicine to get rid of them. Like, like you wouldn't, like, your indigenous medicine didn't actually need to fight this because you didn't have it, because we gave it to you. But I'm not sure that's the best argument to actually make it when you're having the conversation. But I think you're right, Marianne. I think to try to say, can we do a both and here somehow? But when I think about the realities of, like, especially when I think about, like cancer treatments where you're putting these toxic chemicals into somebody's system and you're messing up with their immune system, and if you're dealing with other substances that people are going to put in their bodies that you don't know what's all in them, that can get, for the doctors, I would imagine, make them a bit nervous, because they don't know exactly what's in the stuff that the indigenous practitioners might be using. You have the same issue, frankly, with Indians, because in the Hindu tradition, there's all kinds of, Ayurvedic medicine and all kinds of practices within, well, India and China both, that are Eastern, medicine that they're pretty wedded to. And a lot of them are going to do it even while they're also doing Western medicine. And I'm thinking, ooh, sometimes you never know what kinds of interactions you might be getting yourself set up for there. So yeah, I think again, you'd have to have that conversation of how do we do this in a both and way and keep everybody safe.
What have others been thinking as they've been listening?
I very interesting. Thanks, Denise. I really appreciate it. It was very eye-opening. And I guess a couple of thoughts that I had is that this whole idea of pluralism and all that we want to engage with people of other faiths, other religions, speaking directly to the African American community, faiths, beliefs, it is, we're not even halfway there. This needs to be something that we as a people, religious Black people, need to do in-house with our own stuff. We're not even in the world yet. We're still within our own culture, within our own, the various ethnicities of Black folks, whether they're island or African or whatever. But even within the Christian, quote, Christian religions themselves, there is no pluralism. I mean, people are so ensconced in where they believe and how they believe and what they believe. And a lot of that has to do with racism, the history of where they came from, the mistrust of anybody that's outside of our own ethnicity or our own religious beliefs. And even though our beliefs, a lot of them currently came from white people that have been adapted and then kind of restricted. So we built our own society. And within that, we're so fractured as to, you know, pluralism almost doesn't exist. You got extreme rights and middles and never the twain shall meet. I mean, and we're all Christians, say we believe the same thing, but our interpretations of it are so vast, so varied, so and very often antagonistic toward each other. So as I was listening to that, and it sounds great, and I'm thinking that in the majority of the African American communities of different denominations, this is what we perhaps should be looking at. I mean, we're good about supporting African nations and supporting, you know, but we really don't buy into their stuff. We don't have a good understanding. It's just you know, we want to convert them. It's not really about understanding. It's not about incorporating. It's just like, you know, convert them. We send them food and support their missions, and then they'll know they came from Jesus, and then they'll want to, you know, join us. And so it just, this whole thing just really pointed out to me just how fractured and how unpluralistic we are within our own Christian, Black Christian denominations, which is to a great degree and a lot of times so very drastically different from white Christian America and denominations. So
Well,
that
certainly
was
white Christianity didn't all get along with each other all that well either. I mean,
well, yeah,
like the stuff I've been talking about interreligiously actually had to happen ecumenically too within,
yeah,
like
yeah.
the Protestant denominations have to do, and we still do it. We still have, you know, I mean, I'm on a thing for the National Church of Roman Catholic Anglican Dialogue, right? We're two fairly similar Christian denominations, but we got a lot of differences. And, you know, different mainline denominations have all had to have ecumenical conversations with each other because they were fractured. That's what happened in the Reformation. It wasn't pretty.
So that was my thought from my own people. You know, we need to get this and together ourselves and bring it to the table, because there is no pluralism among us for the most part in denominations. And I absolutely am pretty sure that the majority do not see it that way as regards to other religions and their practices and especially the larger mainline. And then some of the smaller subsets groups that have come are really, really totally, you know, off the radar and as far as pluralism is concerned. So this just really points out how much work that we need to do, not just with other religions, but within our own Christian circles, religious circles, and especially among, and particularly for me, on people of color.
Thanks, Phyllis. As I was listening to you and I was thinking about religions of conversion. I'm a Christian. Most churches know about the Great Commandment, the Great Commission. They fall somewhere heavier on one or the other. And is it harder for people like myself who belongs to a tradition that relies on conversion in some respects to be open, to be more open, to be pluralistic, to actually embrace that, because we want in a way. Does that make any sense to other people? Like somehow I think we have to come to some better understanding or some reconciliation with our own traditions and our and my own faith, and how to be open, and the role of witness or sharing, whatever it is. How does that mesh? I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling, but I feel like there's something in there because of the violence that my own tradition has caused in the history of the world.
Yeah, and as Christians, we have to struggle because, well, our denomination doesn't do evangelization very well anymore, but we certainly had a long missionary history. You wouldn't have a worldwide Anglican communion if you hadn't had colonialism. I mean, that's the other piece too. A lot of that gets tied to the Christianity became a religion of the Roman Empire. It was an empirical religion, and then the Roman Catholic Church, and then the Anglican Communion. You had all these European versions of it that were doing this colonialism and imperialism, which isn't really about religion. It's really about power and politics and wealth and all kinds of other things, right? And yeah, so to step back, I mean, I actually wrote a paper a few years ago about the sort of unpacking the Great Commission at the end of Matthew from an interreligious, to try to reframe it in the world of pluralism. Basically, the argument being that when Jesus is saying go and make disciples in Matthew, is saying go and make disciples, the Jesus in Matthew, what he's concerned about is taking care of the least of these, right? His whole thrust in that gospel is caring for the marginalized, the poor, the underdog, and that when he's sending them out to make disciples, he's sending them out to make people who will care for the least of these. He was a Jew. He wasn't trying to convert anybody to his religion. He was trying to get people to take care of the marginalized and to deal with that. And that's what the commission is. The commission isn't to make more Christians, because Jesus wasn't a Christian. He was a Jew, right? And trying to, but that's a hard sell when that particular interpretation of that commission that we've had for the last 100 or so years has been what it is. And what's interesting in the history of the interpretation of that Great Commission, there was a period of time, like within the first early parts of Christianity, like I can't forget the dating now, but it's a long time ago, like way back before lay people got access to the Bible with any regularity. The church basically looked at that Great Commission and thought, well, that made some sense in the first century when the church was starting to, was becoming not Jewish and becoming its own thing, and they needed to go out and make more Christians. But we don't really need that now. It was there was a long period of time when that commission was not given a lot of weight, and then later it got weight again, and that we got to go out and convert everybody kind of thing. So just totally theologically reframing that is part of the work we have to do as Christians too, in order to engage pluralistically.
We have about 2 minutes left. Other questions or insights?
I would say, as a closing thing, when I did my doctoral work for my DMin, I did this Many Faces of God curriculum where I took Christians to different world religions, introduced them to religious pluralism, and to see how people reacted to it. And what was fascinating when I was going through all the data at the end and reading people's reflections and how they described the experience, was that everybody, and I had some very very conservative evangelical Christians in the group. Everybody said that the journey to learning about how other traditions see God and relate to God deepened their own understanding of God, broadened their understanding of God, and made them more committed to their Christian faith, but in a completely different way. As in, they began to see, oh, look at the gifts that this tradition has that had been rich and meaningful to me. But isn't it interesting that, Muslims see God this way and Hindus understand it that? I mean, they were enriched by the differences that they saw and had a deepened appreciation of their own tradition without the sense of we're better than you and we got to make you like us. And it was across the board. It was fascinating. I mean, the stuff I read, especially from some of the very conservative folks after they had these encounters, was fascinating.
I'd say that happens a lot in CPE as well.
Yeah.
Because you have people coming from many times different traditions within the Christian church, but also it's really interesting when we have students who come from outside the Christian tradition, because it makes me look at my own faith and what I value and what's most important and what's most helpful to me, and look for that resonance with the other and say, oh, they can feel just as deeply about what they have as I do about what I have.
Mhm.
And God is so much bigger.
Right.
And
Yeah, somebody wrote in their reflections that she became aware of sort of the broadness and manyness of God by having had this experience, that God was just so much greater than she had seen through only the Christian lens.
mhm. Well, Denise, it's noon. Thank you so much for the conversation, and thank you folks for being here. When we sign off, there will be a very brief survey, I think, that will come up in your browser. If you could just do it, it's just 4 questions. If you could answer that for us, I would appreciate it. Our next Lunch and Learn is in, what are we in, September? So it's in November. And it's about Brian Baker, a former student who's the director of spiritual care at Arnett Ogden Medical Center, is going to come and talk about how to present spiritual care to your organization to build your program. He's doubled his budget in spiritual care in 2 years in the time that he's been there. He's got a lot of good information, and I hope that you'll spread the word to other folks that you know who might be interested in attending that. And thanks everybody for being here.
Question, I'm sorry, did you say this that the slides will be sent?
The-
Did we share those?
The recording will be posted on our website with the other recordings. And Denise, would you mind sharing?
No, no. I mean, Phyllis, if you want I can send you the slides if you want them.
I would like to have those. I mean, I gotta start somewhere. Maybe I can get some clues.
And you and I need to talk anyway about the course.
Yeah, we do. I
Part of.
gotta start coming in, so.
That's great. Well, thanks, everybody.
All right.